all coming out to join us today for what I think is an extremely timely and interesting and unique look at voting trends in America and how they might impact the 2008 election. My name is Frank Michike. I am the Deputy Director of the Next Social Contract Initiative here at New America. We're jumping off today, of course, in our discussion from the findings of Dr. Andrew Gelman in the following book, the Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State. Thank you. What Dr. Gelman has found and what contradicts a lot of the common wisdom as far as voting patterns in America is that the voting patterns of rich and poor states does not reflect the voting patterns of rich and poor individuals. So that leads us to our next set of questions, which are, first of all, what does then predict and reflect those voting patterns of rich and poor individuals? Why have the media failed to tell this story a little more accurately? How does income inequality play into the issue? And more importantly, and David Frum, when he joins us, hopefully will have some comments on this area as well. How do we approach issues of income inequality as far as reducing that? And then finally, what does this mean for the 2008 election? And what does it mean for those of us like the Next Social Contract Initiative who are looking for policy solutions to some of these issues that folks are voting on? What does it mean for us, and how do we go about framing and advancing issues with the knowledge that Dr. Gelman is going to provide on voting patterns and social factors? So I think it'll be an excellent discussion. I know you'll be interested to see some of his findings, and with that I will turn it over to Dr. Gelman. Let me give a brief introduction. Dr. Gelman is a professor of Statistics and Political Science and the director of the Applied Statistics Center at Columbia University. He's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate from MIT and has a PhD in statistics from Harvard University. He's written extensively on voting trends and political behavior, including most recently Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State. Dr. Gelman.
Thank you. Should I stand here?
You can stand wherever you'd like. If you want to.
A podium, please. Oh, okay.
Podium work?
Yep.
Okay. Every election, 2008 included, is a contest between two views of the future: liberal dynamism or fearful conservatism. Is the majority of Americans confident enough to look to the future, or does fear keep them in the past? Or, to put it another way, what vision is going to win this time? The liberal nanny state, or conservative policies that unleash the power of the free market while respecting the effectiveness of families and local communities? We have different ways of looking at political polarization. You all know where you live here. And this is certainly one. The geographic polarization here also represents a polarization in lifestyles and attitudes. And this is one way we see the divide between Democrats and Republicans. A completely different view of polarization is the one espoused by the late John Edwards, the two Americas, with the haves more likely to favor conservative Republican policies and the have-nots being on the sides of the insurgent Democrats. What do the data say? I can't resolve the economics and policy questions. That's for the people who work here, and I won't even try. But one thing I can tell you is what's going on with public opinion. What is the red-blue divide? Is it rich Democrats on the coasts and lower-income Republicans in the heartland? Or is it the two Americas, with well-off Republicans trying to fend off waitress mom Democrats? Or is polarization itself overstated, an artifact of our two-party system and politicized news media that create sharp divisions where none exist? Our story begins with an article in the Atlantic Monthly by David Brooks after the 2000 election. He drove from wealthy liberal Montgomery County, Maryland, to rural conservative Franklin County in Pennsylvania, a place with no Starbucks, no Pottery Barn, no Borders or Barnes & Noble, a lot fewer sun-dried tomato concoctions on restaurant menus, and a lot more meatloaf platters. Well, check your lunches now. Brooks's article stirred a lot of debate, and I naively thought at the time I could come in and clean things up. he was talking about red and blue states and red and blue counties, but what about the poll results showing richer people being more Republican? I put together a team of students, David Park, Boris Shore, Joe Buffumi, and Geronimo Cortina, all of whom are professors around the country now. But much to our surprise, things didn't come out the way we thought. So what do the data say? Here's the map of the 2004 election. You can see the blue states that are filled with rich, Starbucks-sipping Democrats, and the red states with their regular guy, middle American Republicans. Now, this is not just an illusion of the map. Indeed, Democrats really are doing better in rich states. George W. Bush won the 15 poorest states on the left side of the graph, starting with nearly 60% of the vote in Mississippi. And at the other end, Kerry and Gore before him won in Connecticut and 8 of the 10 next richest states. As TV pundit Tucker Carlson said, okay, but here's the fact that nobody ever mentions. Democrats win rich people. Over 100,000 in income, you're likely more than not to vote for Democrats. People never point that out. Rich people vote liberal. I don't know what that's all about, saith Tucker. Actually, though, Tucker was wrong. Rich people vote Republican. Here are the exit polls from 2004. In nearly every state, in fact, rich people vote Republican, as we'll get to. Here I'm showing the chance that you vote for Bush as a function of your income. And if rich people were a state, they'd vote like Alabama, Kansas, or Texas. If poor people were a state, they'd vote like Massachusetts, even though Massachusetts is much richer than Alabama, Kansas, or Texas. Now, there's other data supporting this. A colleague of mine collected data from campaign contributions of the Forbes 400 and Fortune 500 executives and found a similar imbalance in favor of the Republicans. You also see it in other elections, not just for president. What's going on? Let's briefly return to David Brooks. Here are the 23 counties of Maryland and the city of Baltimore. And Montgomery County is the second richest county in the state and the third most Democratic. As you can see, it's not going to be hard for David Brooks or anybody else to drive northwest from Montgomery County into a more Republican lower income area. And indeed, that's what he did. Now, I have no quarrel at all with David Brooks. He did some reporting, and he found something that started off as a counterintuitive fact, and it became the new conventional wisdom. And I think he uncovered a lot, both in just straight reporting and also synthesizing that. Now, to continue with some fact-based stereotyping, in these graphs, dark colors mean there's more. So there are more Walmarts, of course, near Arkansas and in other Republican-leaning states by and large. Starbucks expanded from Seattle to other highly Republican areas such as Oregon, California, Idaho, and all the rest. Well, maybe it's not a perfect relationship, but what this graph does show you, does emphasize, is that different parts of the country really do feel different. And they're different in how they vote and also in how they behave and consume. Now let's consider Texas. It would have been difficult for David Brooks to drive from a rich county in Texas to a poor county and get the contrast he saw around here. Collin County is the richest county in Texas. It's a suburb of Dallas, highly supportive of George Bush. And Zavala County at the other end of the state, it's low income and doesn't give the Republicans many votes at all. The red-blue divide in Texas is different from that in Maryland and Pennsylvania. What I'm going to do for the next half hour is to resolve the paradox that Democrats win rich states and Republicans win rich voters. And the key to the story, as illustrated by Maryland and Texas, is that different things are happening in different parts of the country. Your income is associated with how you vote in various subgroups of the population as well as in general. But the relationship depends on where you live. The rich in a place like Texas, where you live, determines how you vote to a much greater extent than in a place like Maryland. Here, this graph shows processed data from polls, modeled a little bit. Mississippi is the poorest state, Ohio is the middle income state, and Connecticut is the richest state in the country. For each state, I'm showing the probability you vote for Bush as a function of your income. This is family income on a national scale. Mississippi has more, there are more lower income people in Mississippi and relatively more higher income people in Connecticut. Within each state, richer people vote Republican, but it's much different in different places. In Mississippi, a very strong relationship. In Connecticut, much less. My co-author Boris calls this the Anna Karenina plot because Tolstoy said happy families are all alike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Similarly, low-income people vote similarly in red and blue America, but richer people vote differently. Now, this is not to say that all low-income people vote the same way. If so, I think Thomas Frank would be very happy and have sold a lot fewer books. But it does tell us that the divide between rich and poor states is not happening here. It's happening at the high end. We'll get back to that. Here's looking at another way. This is the results of the 2004 election. As you can see, I really had to get this talk in right before the election, because otherwise all my graphs would be out of date. Red are the states that I'm looking separately at counting only voters in the top 5% of family income, the middle third, and the bottom 1/6. Red means Bush won, and blue means Kerry won. Bush won 46 states among the rich, only losing in the hyper-blue cultural elite states of California, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. I think of this as the prototype red-blue map, more red-blue than the actual red-blue map in some sense. The true, what we're really thinking when we talk about blue America being liberal and red America being everything else, we're really talking about how rich people vote. When you get to the middle-income voters, Kerry picked up a few sort of cultural elite states, such as Washington, Oregon, Illinois. These states also have maybe a little bit more of that middle American redneckism to them also. As we get to poor voters, Kerry won almost all the states, and there's no relation between the income of the state and how Bush and Kerry did among poor voters. And that's what these graphs show. That the relationship between being in a rich state and voting Republican and voting Democratic is very strong among rich voters, but not so much at all as you go down. So we say the differences between red states and blue states are real, but these differences occur among rich, not poor voters. So far I've explained the paradox, how rich and poor mean different things in different parts of the country. Now I want to explore how people could have gotten this wrong. Some quotes from the left and the right. Nicholas Kristof said one of the Republican Party's major successes over the last few decades has been to persuade many of the working poor to vote for tax breaks for billionaires. Well, like in a sense, of course, no one's directly voting for that. People vote for a package, which might include tax breaks for billionaires. But he's not really right. I mean, he's literally right that many of the working poor voted Republican, but more of the working poor voted for the Democrats, as we've seen. And beyond that, it's not a success over the last few decades. As we'll get to, the Democrats are really doing as well among low-income voters as they ever have. There's not some new trend going on there. Michael Barone, author of the Almanac of American Politics, a man who knows more about American political geography than I'll ever know, said, wrote, who are the trust funders? People with enough money not to have to work for a living or not to have to work very hard. These people tend to be very liberal politically. Aware that they have done nothing to earn their money, they feel a certain sense of guilt. They are citizens of the world with contempt for those who feel chills up their spines when they hear the Star-Spangled Banner. Well, I can relate to that. Well, what's actually interesting about this, well, again, he's not right. Like, I mean, unless you define trust funders as rich people who Michael Barone doesn't like, there's not really a relationship here. If anything, the data show that richer people are more likely to support the Republican Party. But here's the deal. If these are extremely smart, very well-informed people, if they get things right, that's boring. I'm not going to come here and talk about it. But if they make a mistake, now that's interesting. There's got to be some fundamental thing going on. Again, like people who from from the left, you get a similar perspective. A different perspective, but sort of people trying to explain the same fact or the same non-fact. In this case, the idea that working class people are voting Republican. Now, if anything is the matter with Kansas from the Thomas Frank point of view, it's really the high-income people in Kansas Frank has to complain about, because the richer you are in Kansas, the more likely you were to vote for Bush. Granted, half of the low-income people in Kansas are voting for Bush, which might seem a bit high and perhaps upsetting if you're a Democrat, especially from Kansas. However, this is not new. Kansas has been solidly Republican for 70 years, over 70 years. So you don't really need to explain the Republicanness in Kansas as a function of some clever message targeted at low-income people there, given that they've been voting that way for a long time. So again, how do people who know so much make mistakes? Sometimes mistakes in emphasis, such as Thomas Frank, sometimes really mistakes in the facts, as we illustrated with Tucker Carlson. This is everybody's favorite quote, one of everybody's favorite quotes. Pauline Kael, the movie critic, was said to have said in 1972, "I can't believe Nixon won. I don't know anybody who voted for him." And you know, I'll tell you, he won 24-1 in my second grade class, so I don't know what she's talking about. Now, she didn't say that, and I looked this up on the web. It's pretty clear she didn't say that. There's no documentation. And also, circumstantial evidence, she's not an idiot. And you'd have to be an idiot to say that, given that there are newspaper articles, Nixon's ahead, Nixon's going to win, Nixon's about to win, Nixon won. But this is such an appealing quote. It feels so right. It just feels right. And cognitive psychologists talk about the availability bias, which is that we draw inferences based on our local environment. So, for example, being from New York, I tend to think everybody lives in a roach-infested apartment. You have your own availability biases. And so even though she didn't do this, it just feels right. Now, what about a more subtle bias? So again, I'm picking on Michael Barone because he knows so much, that when he does slip up, it is more interesting. It evidently irritates many liberals to point out that their party gets heavy support from super affluent people of fashion and does not run well among the common people. Well, the money spent on fashion has been in the news a lot lately. But again, the point is, it's not actually correct. Why would he think that? Well, here's Michael Barone, rich and liberal, maybe not so liberal, but here are many people who Michael Barone knows over here. In fact, many people I know are in this quadrant. Now, the average American has to be here. Well, they have to be here because I drew this graph, so the average is here. So, therefore, well, there obviously must be people over here to balance the scales. Now, not quite right statistically. Statistically, more people are in here. We talk in the book about the correlation between economic and social attitudes and income. It's not high, but it's positive. But it just seems so natural to do that, and not quite right. We call this a second-order availability bias. Now, as I've told you a few dozen times already, richer people tend to vote Republican. But you can look at subgroups of the population, and there are some subgroups where richer people vote Democratic. A few. I can tell you more later, but one of the subgroups was, for which this was true, was journalists. We looked at data from a survey of journalists. Most journalists do not state party affiliations, but the ones who did, the richer ones were more likely to vote for Democrats. This is not a surprise. Richer journalists more likely to be in places like New York and Washington, D.C. Nonetheless, fact it is, and perhaps it is easier for journalists to make this mistake. Remember earlier we said the smallest differences between rich and poor are in the rich states, which is where the national media live. Maryland, Virginia, New York, California, Massachusetts, places like that. The most national journalists do not live in Texas. Now, David Frum and I had an email discussion, so I've now met him, in which he pointed out that in Missouri, actually, some of the relationships between rich and poor are, oddly enough, similar to around here. So it's not a strict divide of middle America versus the East Coast, but where the journalists live, the relation between income and voting is smaller, and it's maybe easier to make this mistake. This stuff Now, again, I emphasize I'm not trying to criticize journalists. This stuff is difficult and provides endless room for debate among political scientists as well. Here's a graph that we made based on surveys asking people how they would vote on a bunch of issues that Congress members and senators voted on. And as a result, you can scale everybody. Remember, like, is Barack Obama the 5th most liberal Democrat in the Senate, that sort of thing. Well, you can answer these questions and find out if you're the 5th most liberal Democrat in the Senate or whatever. And we did this on a survey, and you find that voters are divided, unsurprisingly. We didn't use voters' stated ideologies to do this. This is purely based on how they would have voted on issues. But politicians are further divided. Voters, on average, tend to be in the middle, at least on issues that are voted upon in Congress. As I said, lots of debate about what this means and where this is going. We talk about this a bit in Chapter 8 of our book. So far, I've explained the paradox, how context matters, and how this is tied into popular misunderstandings. Now, let me discuss what this means for American politics. So first, some historical perspective. Here's the map of Gerald Ford versus Jimmy Carter. Looked a lot different than the current map, the most recent maps. Here is sure Carter won New York and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. Ford won New Jersey, Connecticut, and California, and all sorts of interesting patterns. Illinois used to be a solidly Republican state, had Republican governors for a long time, as was California. There's no relationship. Here I'm plotting the vote for Ford based on given the income of the state. There's no relationship between being in a rich or poor state and how you voted. So the red-blue map is indeed news. It is not, again, not an illusion of the map in 2000. It makes sense that there was a lot of talk about rich states and Democrats after this. Here's more historical detail. Here I'm showing, for each year, the difference, the Republican vote share in the richer states minus the Republican vote share in the poorer states. The richest third and the poorest third of the states. And positive values mean that rich states go Republican. Negative values mean rich states go Democratic. A steady trend, here's 2000 and 2004. Indeed, it makes sense that in 2000 there was a lot of talk because it really was the culmination of a long trend. For the first time in 2000, the difference between rich and poor states was as large as the difference between rich and poor voters. Geography, rich in income, the income of geography really somehow does seem to be more important than it used to be. Part of this is the South, but it's not entirely the South. If you just look outside the South, you'll see a similar pattern. What about voters? Here I'm showing Republican vote share among the rich minus Republican vote share among the poor, richest third and poorest third. The difference was high in the post-New Deal period. It was low in the 50s and 60s. And in the 1950s, there was an era of less partisanship. Eisenhower was a Republican president whose most notable economic act was to not try to dismantle Social Security. And John Kennedy was a Democratic president whose most notable economic act was a tax cut. And voters responded to that by not being class polarized or economically polarized. Since the late 60s, however, there's been a big jump and things are back to where they used to be. There's really two messages I want to draw from this graph. First is that the differences between rich and poor have been there for a long time. It's not new. Second, there was no golden era of class-based voting. If you go back to the post-New Deal era, there was still a mix of low-income Republicans and high-income Republicans, and similarly for Democrats. The difference back then was pretty much the same as the difference now. Again, we see this in the South and also in the non-South. I will skip this more complicated graph that you would have to decipher if you read the book. So what do we need to explain? We need to explain that voters in richer states support Democrats, even though within any given state, I shouldn't have this here, I'll distract you. Voters in richer states support Democrats, even though within any given state, richer voters tend to support Republicans. The slope within a state, the pattern of rich voters supporting Republicans, is strongest in lower income Republican-leaning red states. And finally, everything we have to explain has occurred pretty much in the last 20 years. So that's where we are. We no longer need to explain why New York and California are more liberal than Texas and Mississippi. What we have to explain is why high-income people in these rich states are more liberal than high-income people in poor states, and why it's occurred in the last 20 or so years. Here are some quick explanations that don't quite work. The first explanation would be rich people are changing. Rich people are Democrats. That would explain everything, but it's not true. What about race? If you do an analysis just on white people, you still see this difference between rich and poor states. Not as large, race explains some of it. Now, when I bring this up, people often point out that racial politics affects how white people vote also, and I don't deny that, but it's not simply an issue of black people voting one way and whites voting another. Even among whites, we see this. Again, the South is part of the story, but not the whole story. Income inequality is also part of the story, but again, not in any simple way. When we put in income inequality into the model, it does not explain away our effects. So what is our story for what's been happening in the past 20 years? Well, let's separately look at rich and poor states. So in poor states, rich people are more economically conservative than poor people. Fine. In rich states, such as New York or California, rich people are more economically conservative than poor people, but also more socially liberal, and in addition, less religiously observant. Now, putting that together, we find that there's not a lot of evidence that the voters have changed in the past 30 years or so, that the relative positions of the states have changed. Rich states are rich now, and they were rich 30 years ago. But the parties have become more polarized, and indeed, people are voting based on of course, in the news now, the economy. The economy continues to be the #1 issue that people vote on, but people also vote on social issues, the data show, to an extent that they didn't used to do. It's a lot harder to be a liberal Republican or a conservative Democrat than it used to be. And indeed, what the answer to what's the matter with Connecticut is that richer people in Connecticut are actually less likely to be churchgoers, more likely to be socially liberal, and despite their economic conservatism, they're a bit torn in a way that rich people in Mississippi are not. Now that I've explored the paradox and how it's arisen over the past 20 years, I want to connect this to some deeper ideas about economic status and political beliefs. And I would also like to connect it to policy issues. We talk a little bit about that in the book, but again, I think the people here are much more of an expert on that than I am, so I'll defer to them. So the culture war, again, really more of an issue among the rich than the poor. This is sort of cheating because Goldwater's quote is from 1962, but his own version of the Jesus land map was to just saw off the eastern seaboard. But at the lower end of the income scale, somehow you just don't see Rodney King getting all exercised about the difference between red and blue states. He's just happy to be out there, not getting hurt. Now, a related issue is that polarization itself means different things to different people. And to many voters, sort of ordinary voters, polarization represents people being frustrated that the government can't do anything, with something like the Hurricane Katrina response being emblematic of that. Among political commentators, polarization it can have a more direct meaning. Tom DeLay, when he stepped down from the House, said that the most common lament, the common lament over the recent rise in political partisanship is often nothing more than a veiled complaint instead about the recent rise of political conservatism. I think there's some truth to that you do get to be, if it's 51-49 going against you, the whole polarization thing seems a little bit more upsetting. It looks like healthy pluralism when you have the 51%. So there's always going to be changes in how people view this. And you see there Barry Goldwater wanting to get rid of the eastern seaboard, whereas presumably the Jesus land people wanted to just get rid of Jesus Land and be in Canada. So it's a different perspective. Whether you want to secede or whether you want to get rid of the others depends on where you stand. So again, a lot of this does come down to social issues. And one quote I liked was George H.W. Bush, when he was running in 1987, said, "I don't know that atheists should be considered citizens." You could say he was being agnostic on the whole citizenship for atheists question. Now, what's interesting here is not who said this, but that anybody said it, because politicians are not supposed to want to piss people off, but maybe it's worth it if it makes other people happy. And so there is a sense that religion is important enough that it's actually maybe worth even losing a few votes to get your stance right on this. David Brooks pointed out another cultural divide. Very few of us could name even 5 NASCAR drivers. No, I actually love that because, as if I could name 4. Like there's that guy Junior somebody, and then didn't Tom Wolfe write about a guy one? He might have been a NASCAR driver. I don't think Chuck Yeager was. And there was some guy who died, or they made a movie about, whatever. I can't name 5. But there is a sense, right, that this is connected to your view of the issues. This is connected to all sorts of things, not merely whether you like to watch football or baseball or anything else. In political science, there are sort of 2 ways we think about it. One is the idea of the opiate of the masses, that I guess Karl Marx was really more of an economist, but the idea that rich people vote their interests, but poor people are distracted from their interests and vote based on God, guns, and gays. A different view is called post-materialism, the idea that as an individual or a society or a family gets richer, they can afford to not worry so much about how to put food on the table and think more about the higher things in life, such as the environment or abortion rights, maybe even human rights and foreign policy, all sorts of things like that. Now, both of these theories have to be correct. I mean, obviously, there are people and lower income people who do think about God, guns, and gays, and it's also true that a lot of richer people do start thinking about cultural issues, less that don't directly affect their pocketbook. But both theories can't both be true on aggregate, right? Somebody's going to be affected more by this, and somebody's going to be affected less. So what do the data say? Here I'm showing the probability that you voted for Bush in 2004 among frequent church attenders, occasional attenders, or non-attenders. This is religious attenders in general, of course, mostly church. And among the rich, this is high, rich, okay. Among the rich, there's a big difference between religious and secular voters, a 35-point difference. Among the poor, much less. So the evidence is, there's evidence from other sources too, such as surveys where you ask people why they voted and you ask people about how they stand on the issues and use that to predict their vote. There's evidence that among all groups, as I said, the economy is the #1 issue, but that social issues, religion, are more important among higher income voters. We call this the opiate of the elites. Religious voting is not unique to the United States. As we discuss in the book, in countries around the world, religious voters consistently vote for conservative parties. That's no surprise to those of you familiar with the history of Europe, but it's actually still true. It's typically the richer voters who are more divided by religion in other countries as well as the U.S. So I wanted to go beyond the stereotypes of the yuppie Democrats and down-to-earth Republicans. I like to say it's not Prius drivers versus pickup drivers, it's Prius drivers versus Hummer drivers, would be a better comparison. But again, the stereotypes are not wrong, they're just maybe more geographically localized than people realized. This is by no means an attempt at debunking David Brooks, Thomas Frank, or anything else, but rather to delineate the domains of applicability of this work. Political polarization, again, has this rich-poor element to it and this red state, blue state element, and they are relevant in different places and among different subpopulations. George Clemenceau said that war is too important to be left to the generals, And I feel statistics is too important to be left to the statisticians, which is why I'm speaking at a group like this, as well as tomorrow speaking at the University of Chicago Statistics Department. We put a lot of research, actually did a lot of work to display our results. We have only graphs. We have no tables of numbers in our book. But even beyond that, we actually did some statistical research on how to portray the data graphically while using as little information as possible. Unlike many empirical books of this sort, we do not spit out multiple regression coefficients, but we try to actually get approximate the statistical power of such results with more direct approaches. The idea being that policymakers or opinion leaders or even political strategists will be able to look directly at the graphs in our book and draw their own conclusions rather than anything else. People have said that our story is a little messy, but of course, so is life. Now, I know I've brought up a lot, and there's a lot more in the book. I want to leave you thinking about three things. First, that Democrats win rich states, but Republicans do better among upper middle class and richer voters within each state. Second, that the culture war is real, but is concentrated in the upper half of the income distribution. Finally, one reason people get confused is that the media center states don't look like the rest of the country. Income matters more in poorer, conservative, less educated states, and least in richer, more liberal states with higher levels of education. And again, we're using income as a predictor because this is what everybody talks about. I'm not by any means saying that income is driving everybody's vote, or even anybody's vote in some sense, merely that the correlation of income with various economic and social attitudes is different in different parts of the country, leading to patterns where a Chuck Schumer will get a lot of support from rich people in his state, whereas a Trent Lott might not do so well among the poor where he's running. Now, it's been a pleasure being here. I encourage you to ask any questions you might have after the discussants, of course. And if I've refuted stereotypes and giving you a sense of how the scientific study of polls and elections gives insight into how people vote, then I think I've done my job for today.
Thank you, Andrew. That was extremely interesting. Our next speaker will be David Frum. As I'm sure many of you know, David is among the most prolific and insightful Republican commentators in Washington, D.C. He's written several books, including his most recent, Comeback Conservatism, which challenges the Republican Party to take a new approach to issues like health care, environment, families, immigration, and other controversial issues. His recent articles in the New York Times Magazine and in op-ed in the Washington Post this weekend similarly challenge Republicans and predict some very bad things for November 4th, along the lines of their not having risen to that challenge yet. So he will have, I'm sure, several interesting points to make on that topic. David is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a former senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He is also a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush and has received a BA and MA from Yale and a JD from Harvard. So please welcome David Frum.
Thank you all. Thank you, Andrew. I apologize first for the informality of my garb. It was pumpkin patch day at my youngest daughter's school, so I'm straight here from the working in the pumpkin fields. The kind of migrant labor work that upper-income voters are increasingly being subjected to. And just the kind of thing we have to look forward to when the tumbrils of the Obama terror roll through Washington. I was very gratified by and helped by Andrew's book. I'm only sorry it was not available to me when I was working on my book, because it has had a very profound impact on my thinking, and I'm not finished thinking about it yet. So a lot of what I'm going to say here is kind of tentative. I think I would have come across it sooner had I thought to look in the children's literature section of Borders rather than hunting for it in the Borders section. I think it got misfiled there. I became interested in a lot of, well, we're all interested in this topic and we all have a lot of views about it, but I began to look at it very seriously for an article that grew out of something that I came across while working on my book about conservatism. I got very interested in the state of Missouri, which is, of course, when we thought it was going to be a closer election than it's turned out to be, looked like it was going to be a very important state for the 2008 election. And what was helpful to me was it turned out the state of Missouri had commissioned a major study of county by county inequality in the state of Missouri. There are 114 counties in Missouri. They had studied them all and with great detail, and they'd identified a dozen of them as equality centers and a dozen of them as inequality centers. Now, when you hear where these are, they will come as no surprise to you. The inequality centers were, of course, the upper income areas of St. Louis, typically, other cities in the state, but especially St. Louis, and gentrifying areas near the university. These were areas that had been very run down, but had a lot of desirable Victorian housing, close to museums, close to schools. You know the picture. The other type of inequality areas were areas where there had been plantation agriculture in the 19th century, and that left behind a legacy of a lot of the descendants of the people who had been doing the plantation agriculture and a lot of descendants of the people who had been enjoying the benefits of the plantation agriculture, and they too were very unequal. And it won't surprise you to hear, or maybe it will a little bit, where the inequality was centered, and that the equality was centered, and the equality was centered in the exurbs ringing the old suburbs of the major cities of the state. So you look at this map, and then you pull out the map of voting patterns, and what you saw were the most equal areas of Missouri were also the most Republican. Now, this is a somewhat different consideration than that which Andrew's looking at. What seemed because these highly equal areas were as characterized by the absence of wealthy people as they were characterized by the absence of poor people. Poor people could not buy into these areas, or perhaps they would be coming soon, or perhaps the people who bought these McMansions were soon on their way to being poor. But when they did the survey in the early years of this decade, there an absence of poor people in these areas, also an absence of rich people on the wouldn't be caught dead there principle. Now, these areas, what distinguished these areas? Well, they were disproportionately white. They were disproportionately well but not highly educated. They were disproportionately young, and they had much larger number of children than usual. And what you saw was a kind of middle-class utopia that, at least in the beginning years of this decade, coincided strongly with Republican voting practices. And I think that is the core of the truth that Brooks and Franks and others are grappling with, which is that there was this moment where, perhaps because of the cultural issues, perhaps because of these cultural issues, perhaps because of lifestyle changes, perhaps because of religion. I wasn't able to look at how religious these areas were. That these people who were they were not in the middle, they were a little better off than most, but who were less differentiated from each other, and who had chosen to live with other people who were less differentiated from them, because this is not all the middle-income people of Missouri. This is the middle-income people of Missouri who had chosen to live with other middle-income people and not in other kinds of areas where there might have been more diversity of income or race or outlook, how these people behaved and voted. And there was something that struck me as very important there. But as one of the things I've been grappling with as I've had a chance to review Andrew's work is whether or not we have been shooting at a moving target, and that we are trying to make political statements about a landscape that is not stable. I think political scientists are often very nostalgic for American voting in the late 19th century, where people were mad about the Civil War, they stayed mad about the Civil War, they stayed mad about the Civil War for about 30 years, and you could really make strong predictions about what they were likely to do in a band of elections from 1870 to the turn of the century. What I have been increasingly thinking is that what we have been watching and what we have making these great statements about voting behavior in as a decade of great political transition and instability, and that the period from 1992 to 2004 was a toss-up period in American politics, where you had a new party system struggling to be born. We will see in this election what happens, but there were a lot of moments Historically, American politics has had one party stronger than the other, but there have been two periods. There have been two periods of relative stasis, and the first of those periods was the period of the 1880s. You'll remember before the Civil War, the Democrats were America's dominant party. People went through the experience of the Civil War, but the people who were 45 when the Civil War ended didn't have their views changed just because they'd been through this major experience. They went on voting Democratic, which is the way they'd been voting for the first half of their lives, and they were still voting, casting votes in the 1880s. The people who were formed by the Civil War, especially in the North, were the people who were young during the Civil War period, and they don't take over the scene until the 1890s. And so from 1876 until from 1876, you have 5 elections in a row where the winner does not clear the 50% of the vote threshold. As the society digests the outcome of the Civil War, and finally the people who are young in the 1860s become people who are the dominant core of the adult population in the 1890s, and they then vote Republican heavily from the 1890s until the 1930s. In the same way, you can look at the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. As a kind of afterboom, obviously much smaller, much less bloody, but in its impact on people's thinking and behavior, it may be as powerful as what happened in the 1860s. And just as you have 5 elections in a row in the 1880s, 1870s, and 80s where the winner doesn't clear 50%, you have 3 in a row in 1992, 1996, and 2000 where the winner doesn't clear 50%, reflecting a society that is still coming to terms with these unleashed cultural revolutions. America is going to absorb this cultural shock of the 1960s, or is in the process of doing it in the same way that it absorbed the cultural shock of the 1860s. And this election may be a little bit about that. And one way to sum up what happened in that shock may be an acceptance that the right won the argument on economics and the left won the argument on culture. This is a familiar point, but it sort of corresponds to what you see in Andrew's data. Because after all, if people thought that Chuck Schumer were a radical redistributionist, even his latte-sipping upper-income hedge fund managers in New York would not overlook the proposal to confiscate major parts of their income because of their support for abortion. That it is precisely because they have because they've accepted that the Democratic Party is not an economically radical party, that they are now at liberty to vote in the way that they do. And in the New York Times article I wrote about these issues, I said that the 2 most important words in understanding today's Republican dilemma are the words Robert Rubin. He emancipated the voting behavior of upper income America. We may now be heading toward a new kind of political stasis. And as a Republican and a conservative, for me, some of the most important questions hanging over this election are: how does the Republican Party respond to what seems to be coming? I have a theory that, just like the famous whose line was it about the 4 stages of reaction to the diagnosis of a fatal illness? There are 3 stages of reaction to bad political defeat. In the first, you blame the losing candidate. In the second, you blame the voters. And only at the very end, you begin to blame yourself and to consider some possibilities of change. Working through those, I think one of the things that Republicans are going to be asking themselves is our future, in this, as we go through this transitional period, is our future perhaps to re-intensify our reach to down market voters? Is that something we're going to try to do? Or is our future to try to reach out to those upper income voters who have been culturally alienated but who are economically open to our message? Which way to go? Is the answer Sarah Palin, or is it Mitt Romney version 1.0? I can't predict how that's going to come out. But that, I think one of the reasons I can't predict it is that will depend a great deal on the choices that the Democratic Party chooses to make. Does Barack Obama govern in the Robert Rubin method? If he does, that really almost leaves the Republicans no choice but to go down the Sarah Palin path. Does he choose a more economically radical method? Is he more economically redistributionist? Or is the Congress more economically redistributionist and he unable to stop it? Or is this economic turbulence that we're going through, does it turn into a crisis so severe that somehow forces his hand and pushes him in a much more radical direction than maybe even he now intends? Those are all imponderables, questions that I at least can't answer. And on them, I think hangs a great deal of the future, at which point Andrew will need new charts. And I thank you for your attention, and let's have some questions.
We're going to move over here for the discussion period. And before we get to the fun part, which is obviously dissecting the map, both 2004 and then what it's going to look like, what it looks like right now for 2008, we should, in honor of our mission here, which is policy, talk about some of the policy issues very briefly. Inequality comes up, David, in particular in your article in the New York Times. And you attribute it, from my reading, to two major factors. One is the changes in the typical family, what it used to look like, what it looks like now. The other is globalization, largely. The fact that lower income folks are competing with the world as opposed to their neighborhood or their state or whatever. Can you, from that diagnosis, provide some insight on how we might tackle this issue of inequality, which is a big part of what we're looking to do as part of this next social contract initiative?
Yes, thank you. I would probably give three, not two, because I would subdivide globalization between two aspects. One is trade, and the other is immigration. And this is where I think ideology comes in. Because although I recognize that trade changes and investment changes have a major impact on inequality, as an ideological matter, I'm just not prepared to do anything about that. For me, free trade is one of those stand or fall issues that, if it has negative, the negative consequences of protectionism seem to me to be so horrifically terrible, world wars, that kind of thing, that I'm prepared to swallow quite a lot of inequality in order to avoid them. So I have 2 + 1 policy levers that I would be thinking about deploying. Policy lever number one is, I think, immigration, not the most important driver, but it's the one with the worst cost-benefit analysis. That is, the costs are very great, the benefits, at least to Americans, are very small, and the impact and its impact on inequality is considerable. So I would want to see a much more restrictive approach to immigration, and a transfer of such immigration as does occur from low-income preferred labor, what we now do, which is we now de facto have a policy that favors low-skilled labor to one that favors more high-skilled labor. It's happened, as is the policy, by the way, in Canada and Australia, two countries that look very much like the United States and have seen a slower rise in inequality than in the United States. And the second is, on the point about the family structure, I think it's obviously hugely important. I mean, it's almost true by definition that when you change the families, you're comparing households, and when you begin to compare different kinds of households, you're going to see, when the households begin to change. I don't know what the policy is, but I think, I don't think anybody does, but I think the discussion there needs to start. And we need to recognize that this is not a lifestyle choice. It is not a disguised form of racism to worry about the rise in the single-parent family. It is a huge problem, and governments at least ought to agree that they would like to turn it around, and to begin the hunt for methods to stabilize the family and make sure that as many children as possible grow up to two parents.
And just on that,
And the +1 is healthcare, which is not strictly linked to inequality, but which has a tremendously powerful explainer of the stagnation of middle-class incomes, which is the thing that makes inequality so much more irksome than it was, say, 4 or 5 years ago.
yeah. And I thought that was very interesting. You attribute most of the stagnation to the cost of healthcare. You can almost see the increased GDP flowing straight into healthcare as opposed to wages.
You can see it actually in a very simple chart. Is if you look at median, or their average, unfortunately, average hourly compensation costs, and it's bad to compare averages to median, but it's still suggestive. Average compensation costs go up about $5 an hour in the Bush years, from about 20 to about 25. That's what the employer is paying, adjusted for inflation. But the median wage, what the employee gets, is flat. So there's a significant increase in what the employer pays, no increase in what the employee gets. Where'd it go?
It's a great question, and again, one of the issues we're trying to tackle with the next social contract initiative, on the assumption that fixing that issue and bringing costs into line will eventually get at the inequality issue as well. Dr. Gelman, one of the things I thought was most interesting, and it wasn't in your presentation only because you have so many interesting things to share with us, but in the book, you talk about polarization and how it affects people's perception of issues. I wonder if you could just elaborate on that. The two things popped out to me, and maybe you can build from there. In 1980, you have that nearly 50% of GOP voters viewed the Democratic Party favorably, and vice versa. It's about the same, Democrats viewing Republicans favorably. It's down in the high to mid-30s, it looks like, for both parties now. That's tangible. That's real. The notion that polarization, as Tom DeLay said, is sometimes overplayed depending on whether you're in the majority or the minority. That makes sense too, but this is a real change in perception between the parties, the members of the parties. Can you talk about that and maybe how it feeds into some of the findings on Richest?
The political scientist Mo Fiorina has a phrase which I pretty much agree with: sorting, not polarization. And his story is that, well, let me step back and say we actually have some graphs which I can display if you can pull them back up. Democrats and Republicans are further apart than they used to be on a number of issues, and I'll show you the picture once they're there. Oh, yeah, here we are. Okay. So, well, this is the Iraq War. Democrats support the Iraq War much less than Republicans. This goes up to 2006, while the support was still in the above zero range there. But if you look at if you look at Korea and Vietnam, you don't see such discrepancies. So indeed, Democrats supported the Korean War more than Republicans because Truman was doing the Korean War, and in Vietnam War, the Democrats supported the war more than the Republicans until 1969. I don't remember what happened then politically, but somehow the Republicans started supporting it after that. Now, you could tell story after story, like say, well, the Iraq War is different because Republicans maybe somehow it's easier for Republican voters to support a war than Democrats, but the point is it's happening now. We're seeing these kinds of big divisions. On social issues, this is sort of stunning. Average view on abortion. High numbers are supporting abortion, low numbers are opposing. Really nothing going on until about 1990, and now a big split between Democrats and Republicans. During the Reagan years, no such split. So I do agree with this idea that, on or about 1990, everything changed. So one story is that voters are becoming more extreme. And another story, though, that Fiorina and other political scientists have is that the parties have been moving apart, and then the voters are just sorting themselves better into parties. So you decide, well, I support abortion rights, I can't bring myself to vote for the Republicans. So I think that's happening. We looked at the correlations of issues too, and you find that voters are a lot less coherent than politicians when it comes to bundles of issues. And for a politician, you can predict pretty well his view on a bunch of issues if you know his views on just a few key ones. With voters, telling me how you feel about one issue isn't going to tell me much about how you feel about something else.
Great, thank you. Why don't we go to the candy, which is Dave, if you can bring up the PowerPoint, and we'll get to your questions in a moment. We have here. That's good. Thank you. Okay, so we have here the 2004 map that everyone's very familiar with, and then we have today's Real Clear Politics map, which is they threw out the toss-up category and sort of just went with whichever way it was leaning. Clearly a big difference. I wonder, Andrew, maybe you could start. Can you, based on your data or your findings, explain this to some degree, and then of course there are other elements that we can talk about.
Well, first I have to tell you that on the train ride down here, I computed the probability that your vote would make a difference if you vote in the presidential election. And if you happen to be lucky enough to live in Virginia, we estimate the probability to be about 1 in 10 million. So I would recommend that you all go vote. I actually think you should vote because I think it's like buying a lottery ticket, which has a 1 in 10 million chance of winning. But winning is not that you get a lot of stuff, but that the country and the world gets all sorts of goodies. The goodies that they can only get by having your preferred guy become president. And I think many of us in this room believe that one way or another. So I would actually think 1 in 10 million is great odds, and you should jump at this. Pretty much, this isn't that different from the 2004 map. There's a shift. So I don't think I, the economic conditions are not good. There's not incumbent is not running for re-election. There are a bunch of reasons why the Obama or the Democrats in general were expected to win by a few percentage points this year. So it doesn't seem as exciting to me as it's pretty much what I might have expected a few months ago.
David, I know you have some thoughts on where the Republicans have gone wrong. And
Yeah.
maybe you want.
Well, as I look in this map, it's not, that wouldn't be the map I would guess if I were reckless enough to make predictions. I would emphasize a couple of things in looking at a map like this. I would overlay it with the map showing the steepest percentage reduction in home prices. And you'd see that Nevada, for example, is almost ground zero for the mortgage crisis. Strikes me as that makes a lot of sense to me that would go go blue. Nevada, but I'm not so sure about New Mexico and Colorado. They have not seen those kinds of steep reductions in home prices, but they have had the ethnic change. One thing that I want to maybe add, just based on your last go around, I just saw the movie W, which I can't recommend. But there's this one scene that I thought was. There are parts of movies about politics that offer sort of comforting illusions. One of the Karl Rove characters always carrying around these gigantic binders, as he in fact does, and the inference that you're invited to draw is that the way politicians arrive at their questions about when we look at the abortion division, they start with their analysis of the data and their cynical view. And just as there was a certain kind of left-winger who used to believe that the paper to read was the Financial Times, was at least the capitalist class had to tell itself the truth. In the same way, there's a belief that politicians must tell themselves the truth. But it has really always been remarkable to me, knowing a lot of politicians, how much they are in thrall to stories that they tell themselves about where votes are. That Republicans really do believe in the story of the salt of the earth, middle of the road, working class voter who's voting for the Republican Party because of the abortion issue in particular, and that belief has been a huge driver in the political choices that the parties have made, and you can see it affect even a John McCain. That he had a lot of choices going into this convention about the kind of vice president. Now, normally a vice president isn't very important, but one of the things I find myself thinking about, I had a chance to talk to somebody who had urged this point of view on him. Supposing he'd picked Lieberman, and there had been the walkout that everybody dreaded, that he would now be in a position to go around to the country saying, "You hate Republicans? Who hates them worse than me? And they hate me in return. They walked out of my convention." But McCain was in thrall to a particular story, the story that Sarah Palin represents, and that Andrew here is keen to debunk.
Cognitive psychologists talk about the illusion of control. Lots of experiments, for example, in a Vegas-like setting, if you're rolling the dice and you're trying to get a big number, people throw the dice harder, and when they're trying to get a small number, they very gently dump them onto the table. I think that politicians have a lot less control over the election outcome than they might think or hope. They've reached the top or near the top of the greasy pole by doing well and getting lucky a lot of times. They certainly have control to screw things up, but do they have control to get what they want? Not always. There's always opposition. A few years ago, I wrote an article, which was just published in the Annals of Applied Statistics, called Should the Democrats Move to the Left on Economic Policy? And I guess the new article would be written as, should the Republicans move to the left on economic policy? I actually concluded in that paper that the Democrats should not move to the left on economic policy, maybe to the right a little bit, but we, as a side note, did conclude that the Republicans would gain a little bit by moving to the left, maybe as much as 2% of the vote if they're willing to sacrifice policy concerns to do so. But still, 2% of the vote is only 2%. So I don't know how bad Republicans should feel about a situation like this. This is just the kind of thing that's going to happen to you sometimes.
Andrew, before we go to questions, if you had Thomas Frank here, as we actually worked on getting, but if you had him here and you go out of your way to make clear that you think he's onto a number of things, or that his analysis is not at all completely wrong, But if you had him here, and you could describe in a few sentences where you differ and why you think he may have misperceived some of this, what would it be?
Well, I'm always polite in my professional context, so I think what I would say is that I admire his rhetorical, his analysis of the rhetorical strategies of the Republican Party, and I would ask him how it fits into David Frum's discussion about changes in families. There's, for both Frank and Frum, like it's, I don't know, it's sort of hard for me to believe that the 60s are so powerful as all that, and I'd like to sort of see how the two stories could be integrated. Beyond that, I might ask Frank how he feels about other people interpreting his results to imply that that the Republicans are doing something new with working class voters. Is there really evidence of that? I wouldn't say that he's necessarily saying that, merely giving information that allows people to jump to that set of perhaps comforting conclusions.
David, you've done similar types of research at the county level as you discussed and as you talk about in your New York Times Magazine article. How would you, what would you say to Thomas Frank? It seems you're probably a little closer to his view.
Yeah, I was talking to him just yesterday, so by coincidence. I think I would say to him, especially about his first book, that I found very strange, is his thesis is working class Kansans ought to be voting Democrat, but they are misled into voting Republican because of the Republicans appealing to their cultural values. And the right response among Democrats to the situation is to make fun of working class voters for how stupid they are, and which he then proceeds to do in that book at great length. The book's dominant theme is one of scorn for the people who fall for the Republican trick. And my question I've always had is, if I believed what you believed, and that it's because of Hollywood and abortion that the Republicans are able to do this to you, why don't you change your view on Hollywood? Why don't you then add to your winning economic message, your winning cultural message? And if you won't, then aren't you guilty of doing just what you accuse the voters of, saying, I am so attached to Hollywood and abortion that I won't compromise a bit on that, even though it means I could get the economic results I want?
Interesting take. Let's see, we'll open it up to questions. Could you just, mics are overhead, just say your name and who you're with. Sir, up front. Yeah, don't worry, just nice and loud is all we ask.
I'm Jonathan Roush with National Journal. Thanks, Professor Gelman. I heard the presentation at Cato and came armed with a question, which is I wonder if you could walk us through just a bit how the demographics of this work, because it sounds as if what's going on that needs explaining is that rich people in rich states are voting more like poor people in rich states, and that's what's affecting the picture. But there shouldn't be that many rich people, right? There just aren't many people above 150,000 a year in the electorate, so they shouldn't be having this kind of pronounced effect, should they?
Oh, yeah, I'm really talking about the difference between upper third and lower third of income. So where I said, most of the places where I said rich, you could say the upper middle class. I wouldn't. It's most dramatic. The higher you go in income, the more dramatic the red-blue differences are. And so I isolated that because that's what people are often talking about when talking about cultural wars. But when you actually count the votes, well, sure, the voter turnout is slightly higher among the rich, but when you count the votes, you're really talking about the upper third of the income distribution, not just the top few.
So that would cut off about where, begin about where?
Oh, shoot. I think 70,000 family income, something like that.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Dante Cheney with the Christian Science Monitor. I was wondering, Professor, that you talk about how the states where there are more rich people, the rich tend to vote more like poor people. Is there something about the density of more neighborhoods like that you think they create more of kind of their own culture and tend to go in their own unique way?
Well, we had lots of speculation about that, but my co-authors wisely talked me out of putting anything in because he said that our comparative advantage are the numbers. And so, yeah, I actually could hypothesize a little bit about richer people being more upper half of income people being actually more able to move to places that are more culturally compatible to them, thus creating differences, correlations between geography occurring more at the high end than the low end. And I could also speculate about if you live in New York City, when you hear about a tax cut, you might get scared that they're going to stop running the subways, but maybe if you live out in the country, you might actually like the idea of paying less taxes. And it sort of baffles me, but I've heard people have that view. So we could speculate about that, and I encourage you all to do so. I didn't want to dilute my findings with that.
David, you talked about in your article, as a general rule, the more unequal a place is, the more Democratic, and the more equal, the more Republican. Do you have a theory on why that is?
I have a number of theories. Theory number one is the more unequal a place is, the more likely you are to find a lot of Latino voters there. And Latinos, despite the hopes of the president and Karl Rove, are voting Democratic. Second, that the decision to live, I am going to engage in speculation. The decision to live, that living, especially in a highly equal place, is more so to the decision to live in an equal place than the decision to live in an unequal place, is very much an affirmative decision, because the decision to live in an equal place means to live in a newly built exurb. And that is an important cultural decision of the kind of person you are and the kind of way you want to live.
I had a question back, and then I'll come to you, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, Neil Monroe from National Journal. Is there anything in the economy that encourages wealthier people to be more liberal?
I
should say more socially liberal.
Well, again, I mean, this gets into the sort of speculation thing that the areas of the country that are richer are those with big cities, which perhaps are socially liberal for other reasons. The political scientist Jonathan Rodden at Stanford is writing a book about this, the sort of historical pattern that cities are almost always more left-wing than other areas, not just in the U.S., but in other places. So again, sort of going beyond the legacy of the 1960s and Karl Rove and all that, just more generally, this seems to be a pattern. But I think you can probably speculate as well as I can about that sort of story. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Charles says that. One question for each one. Dr. Gelman, I have a question about this map going to be on November 4th, because the real issue, the war, is not important. The cultural issue, the abortion is not important, because the current event. So I think could be some change. And second, there's one part of people haven't made decision yet. And second is to Mr. Bloom. You have cited two events. One is Civil War and one is Cultural Revolution. I would like to know, do you have an idea what's the portion, percentage of population as independent? Particularly for now, what's the percentage of independent? Because this independent portion could affect somewhat the outcome.
Well, a lot of these political numbers are kind of artifacts. And one of the things that is often said in the past 10 years is that the number of really independents is small. There are a large number of people who say they're independent. They just happen always to vote the same way. And the number of people who are independent enough where they actually vote for different parties in different elections, that is said to be under 1 in 10. But I think you get a lot of those numbers by looking backward, after the fact, at what people have done, not whether they have, not their frame of mind in advance.
And as far as the map, that's not Dr. Gelman's, that's from their politics, so your point may well be taken, but we'll be taken up with them, so.
Yeah, but he also could answer what my question.
As far as
From
how
his-
things might change.
From his view. Yeah. And point of three things is this. One is this. Okay, the real issue, the war, and the cultural issue, abortion, relatively not important for an effect on this. But
Usually, let's.
We sort of have a mental model in which voters, or for that matter, states, are aligned on a left-right scale, and then a lot of the news just is the kind of thing that will make everybody support the Democrats more, the Republicans more. News about the war, for other things, and so you'll see just general shifts. And so that's why I think if you were to plot the vote, make a scatter plot of how the Republicans do, how McCain does in 2008 versus how Bush did in 2004, you'd see extremely high correlation. It's not that these other issues don't matter, but they're not necessarily affecting the relative positions of the different states.
Right. Yes, sir.
Brian Beery from Europolitics. I'm just wondering, with the very rich people, like you were saying that the richer you get, the more Republican you vote. Is there a certain point at which that doesn't hold true, like the multi-mega millionaires, they start voting Democrat?
Well, the data, the best data I've seen on the mega millionaires are from the colleague who collected data from the Fortune 500 executives and Forbes 400 families. And there he found that they predominantly donated to Republicans rather than Democrats. It depended on the area. So oil, pharmaceuticals, chemical industry, very heavy Republican contributors, telecommunications, entertainment industry, Wall Street, much more likely to go for Democrats. Now things are different. Back in Roosevelt's era, oil was a strong Democratic contributor, of course, and Wall Street was big for the Republicans. The aggregate is still the richer people being on the Republican side, but it's different richer people, different industries, probably different policy implications.
Let me throw a couple of thoughts at you about that. One is we certainly do know that when you look at the very richest people in Congress, that they are disproportionately Democratic. I don't know that the last time I looked at this, that of the 5 richest members of the Senate, 4 were Democrats, and it wasn't as stark in the House, but and it was also it was true among governors again, not as stark as it was in the Senate. So that's one suggestive thing. There are patterns of giving that you can look you can look at where the big gifts give. Now this is a very Democratic cycle, so maybe that is distorted. But I was struck, for example, in McLean, which is the New Republic build is the heart, the core of republicanism in America. That the city of McLean gave 50% more money to all of the Democratic presidential candidates than it did to all of the Republican presidential candidates. I wonder though whether it's not also true that once you get to the very highest regions, a lot of this has to do with some very, very specific issues. And how much of our time in Washington we spend on issues like, should electrical wires be regulated by the states and the federal government? And one of these issues that would be just like mind-crushingly boring if $800 billion weren't at stake. Or issues, and there are these great fights. A friend of mine who works in Congress says that he, not as a congressman, but as a staffer, says that he realizes that his job is to act as an arbitrator of disputes between the genuinely rich and the merely well-to-do.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Gelman, historically, when one party was dominant for a significant period of time, I think, for example, the Democratic Party pre-64 in the South, the ideological debate that would ordinarily take place between parties would take place within that party, and that's why the Democratic primaries were so important in the pre-64 South. Did you find in your study of economic voting patterns that one economic group would have a greater ideological debate within that group than another?
I didn't really look at that. The only thing I would say is that getting back to the pattern of close elections in the 1880s and then since 1960, but not much in between, is that I think that national politics is more important than it used to be. And a lot of the early 1900s, when there was very little national political competition, I could imagine that was less of an issue, because if different parties had their local strongholds, they didn't need to compete at the national level. But now Washington is not the only game in town, but certainly the biggest game in town. So I would expect things to bounce back to equilibrium one way or another in the two-party system.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Is income a proxy for education, or if you ran the statistics as education, would they vary?
When we throw education into the model, we still see differences between rich and poor and how they vote, and still see differences between richer and poorer states. If you look at education straight, by the way, you go to the CNN webpage and just do it, like with the 2004 polls, it's pretty straightforward. If you look at education straight, you see that John Kerry did best among the least and the most educated voters, and worst in the middle. But it was a small difference. He was doing 54% where he was doing best, and 44% where he was doing worst. So it's there, but it's not as dramatic as income.
Can I say something about that question? It's a very important one, and I say as someone who long took for granted the two were basically the same. You could use them interchangeably. After the New York Times piece, I got a very interesting paper, which again I've just had a chance to look at. I haven't really worked my way through it to see whether it's true or not. So I'm advancing this other researcher's opinion as something of interest and to be independently verified. But he argued that in fact in a lot of places in the country there are big differences between the two, and suggested that one way to think about what is going on is that you have inequalities of education and inequalities of wealth. They're not the same, and they form a kind of familiar quadrant, but they do correlate with partisanship in this way. So that one way to think about what is the real divide is voters, and these would all be in the upper third these would all be voters in the upper third of the income, so they'd all be inside and one of Andrew's boxes. That the voters with high degrees of education but relatively low degrees of income were the most partisan Democrats in the country, and voters with high degrees with high incomes but relatively low levels of formal education would be among the most partisan Republicans. And if you're trying to figure out why do people like Sarah Palin or hate her, what are they responding? Why is it that so many people, quite well-to-do people, why is it that Rush Limbaugh, who owns a plane, can go on the air and rail about elitism, the elitist attitude? I mean, because he's carrying a lot of psychic wounds. I mean, this is basically Democrat, because we're all children. But Rush Limbaugh too is carrying psychic wounds, and they are the psychic wounds of not having formal education, even though he's got a lot of money.
And in that sense, then the Democrats, those higher educated, lower income Democrats, are the bitter voters, bitter that they've either invested or been given a higher level of education and haven't been able to translate that to income.
Well, you should picture like a teacher or a nurse or a social worker, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. Picture a junior professor
Yeah.
on the one hand, and picture on the other hand like the most successful car dealer in Tulsa.
Yes, sir.
To Mr. Frum, I'd be curious to get your response. I was been really troubled as a Muslim to see the kind of thing that happened with the Republican Party saying that you're trying to be inclusive, and some of the things that happened at the rallies, especially with Ms. Palin. You were talking about in your comments whether it was going to go toward the Mitch Romney or the Palin. How can you talk about reaching out and making a party that's inclusive when you just deliberately, make people like me, who's an American Muslim born here, feel like I'm an immigrant?
Well, you raise a lot of rich issues, and I'm not sure you're going to be able to deal with them all to your satisfaction. One is, I see those rallies exactly the same way you do, through the prism of a television screen. And as somebody who's attended rallies in person, somebody who spent a lot of time in his life at political rallies, what you see on the TV screen is not always what you see when you are there. And so you can have a situation where there's 16,000 people in a place, there are 50 people who do something, and it's visible to another 400 or 500 people around them, but a large number of people have no idea that it's going on at all. So I don't know whether these incidents that we've seen are representative, or whether they're on the news simply because they're extreme. I mean, that is one of the things that the news media does. I mean, it's not true that the state of Louisiana is always buffeted by hurricanes, but if you watch TV, look for scenes of Louisiana, they're mostly hurricane scenes. So I think that a lot of these questions of impression, we said that it was certainly true in 2000 and 2001 that Republicans made a very conscious effort to reach out to Muslim voters. There was a huge effort in Florida, for example, and that a lot of people think was actually, it's hard to count because there aren't good numbers on these things, a lot of people think was quite successful, that the Republicans got a heavy share of the Muslim vote in Florida in 2000, and that may have made a big difference to how things came out. And certainly after 2001, President Bush spoke very emphatically on that question. Your subjective perception is not something that I can fully enter into, but I would just think it's always a big part of political work is finding these telling moments in your opponent and magnifying them. And I think a lot of that both parties are always on the hunt for moments that they can seize, magnify, broadcast, and then say to large numbers of people, see, these people hate. And that's what the bitter comments were about. If you identify more with the Democrats, that you can sort of take a look and say, well, gee, Barack Obama said this one half sentence, it's broadcast all over the world, and that's supposed to be a representative of the way he thinks. You can see why it's an inaccurate representation of reality when it's done to you, harder to see when it's done to your opponent.
Let me close, I guess, with one question, slightly different for each of you. Andrew, do you deal with politicians and their staff? And as a result of this book, have you been contacted, anything like that? And if you do, how do you translate this? Or how do they receive it?
My colleagues have sometimes dealt with politicians and their staff, but I have not directed myself.
But there's applicability.
I think so. I mean, look at Chapter 9. I mean, I think there's a lot of applicability. People, I mean, at the very least, people want to know who they're voting for. I mean, the message that you don't have that much control isn't so appealing, but it can even that can be used possibly to your advantage. Perhaps, for example, maybe it wasn't the smartest thing for the Democrats to do to run an 84-year-old for re-election in the Senate in New Jersey. Given that this is a strong Democratic year, maybe it would have been a good time for them to put in a new face. Maybe in 6 years they're going to come to regret that they have to compete on a level playing field without the incumbency advantage. There's all sorts of things like that. People misinterpreting numbers, people looking at number of seats won rather than votes, and just thinking that there's a mandate when there isn't, misunderstanding the sources of one's unpopularity. That's why I was telling David that maybe things aren't so bad for the Republicans as they might look, depending on, as you said, depending on how things go. But yeah, how to dealt with them directly may well be.
Well, I think there is one that based on the book and based on the presentation, I think there is one conclusion that leaps out at me that is immediately applicable, which is the reason the Democrats have become more competitive since 1992 than they were before 1992 is they have rendered themselves less unacceptable on economic issues to well-to-do voters. And the great question they are going to face in the first 90 days of a hypothetical Obama administration is, do they want to put that reputation at risk in order to achieve some ideological goals that are important to them, or do they not? And when you're wondering how does all of this begin to change, what are the new events, while campaigns may not matter as much as you think, also as we like to think the circumstances matter, the broad identity of the party does. And the fact that Democrats since 1992 are perceived as a much less redistributed party than they used to be perceived, that may be the thing that underlines the whole thesis of Andrew's work.
Right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and please thank our participants. The book is